let's take a step back. JavaScript has two types of scopes, local scope and global scope. Any variable that can only be used in specific parts of your code has local scope. And that intuitively makes sense because you can only use that variable in a local piece of code. You can't use it anywhere, it has to be in one spot. And I wish it was just that simple, but a locally scoped variable comes in two types. You've got function scoped and block scoped. Let me quickly show you an example before we move on in this lecture. What do I mean when I say that a variable has local scope? And that we have two different types of local scope, function scope and block scope. Well, let's have a look at an example. The first thing we should do is create a function. And let's call it test for the lack of a better word. And within this function, let's define a variable called car. And then all we want to do is console log this variable. Now just take a step back and think about what it is we've just done. We've created a function called test. Within that function, within that local scope, within that block, we've defined a variable called car. What happens when we run this function? Well, to run a function, we just got to call its name and enclose it in brackets, and there you go. It executes, and you can see that BMW is consoled to the screen, as we would expect. But what happens if we wanted to access this car variable outside the function? Well, this is what scoping is all about. It is not possible. You can see it's not possible. Car is not defined. We get an error. And this is because of function scoping. Alright, so we see this doesn't work. What about block scoping? What do I mean by that? Well, remember what a block is? A block is just the curly braces. It's all a block of code is. So you can actually see a block is a subset of function because the function requires the curly braces unless you're using the new arrow syntax, which we'll get into later. Let me give you an example of a blocked scoped variable. Let's get rid of this and let's just have curly braces. This is a block. And now let's define a variable called animal. And again, we just want to console that to the screen. No issues there. But what happens when we want to access that animal outside of the block? Animal is not defined. And this is what scoping is all about. I hope it's starting to make sense. What's interesting though is before the let keyword we only had var. And look what happens when we write var. So now all we've done is we've replaced let with var. What do you think will happen now? I would expect animal to also be block scoped. But it's not. Look at that. Warthog is available outside the curly braces when it comes to var. And this is why before the new ES6 syntax came in, people referred to JavaScript as a function scoped language. But that's not the case anymore because now we've got let and const, which means that it's block scoped. Sure, so we're back. Well done. We've done locally scoped. Now let's get on to ding ding ding, globally scoped. A variable declared outside of a function or a block, and all I mean by a block is curly braces, has global scope. And something worth pointing out is that this is only true with JavaScript in web browsers. To declare global variables in Node, you've got to do things a little bit differently. But this course isn't a Node course. I just wanted to put it out there. And again, enough talk. Let me show you a quick example of a global variable. We've seen examples of globally scoped variables. Whew, that's a mouthful. Globally scoped variables. Globally scoped variables. Globally scoped variables. We've seen examples of it. Let me just show you another one quickly to drive the point home. You cannot be too strong on this concept of scoping. So actually, you know what I'll do? Let me just start a quokka. clock is going. Let's create a variable with the value pizza. And now before we go on, just bear in mind that this is a global variable. Why is it a global variable? It's not defined within a function, and it's not defined within curly braces. It's not defined in a block. The default then is that this is globally accessible from anywhere in your code. And to prove it, let's create a function called showFood. And all this does is it console logs favorite food. Taking a step back, if I just console logged favorite food, I would expect to see pizza. Console log favorite food. I'd expect to see pizza, and that's what we see. And the reason we see this pizza is that all we're doing is we're referencing the global variable directly. So in effect, there's no need for us to even have had a function. But has this function worked? Well, remember, to execute a function, I have to call its name and then enclose it in brackets. So I've got to call the name and then have brackets. And now it's executed the function, and you can see the function executes. We haven't defined a variable within the function, within that scope. But yet the function still knows what favorite food is. It's pizza. And this is the power of declaring something globally. And just before we move on, I don't want you to think that you must just declare all your variables globally now, because the one problem, and it's a big problem, with declaring variables globally is name clashes. When you start defining things globally, what you'll find is you can start overwriting variables, even that have been predefined in the browser already. Just don't go there. If you can avoid a global variable, rather do that. What a lot of coders do, if you have to enter a global variable, is they create a global object. So they'll, for example, they'll go let a equals a global object. And then what they do is they attach properties to that object. A dot favorite food type equals pizza. And then if you want to access that later in your code, you can just access your global object, which you always know is A. With the dot notation, you can access all your properties. And that's all you do. And then you can access, let me just console this log, console.log this out so you can actually see the result. And there it is. It's actually accessing this pizza, not the first pizza we defined. Don't worry if you didn't quite understand that. That's more complicated code, which we may get into later in the course. For now, I want you to understand global scopes, local scopes, variables, lets, and consts. And just to end off, remember when dealing with vars, we saw that it was function scoped, meaning that even if you put a var within curly braces, you can still access that var variable anywhere in your code. And because of that reason, JavaScript used to be known as a function scoped language, but not anymore, because with let and const, we've now got block scoping. And this sums it up for scoping.